Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Part 2 here for another episode of Ghouly Gentlemen Horror Month. I'm joined by my good fiend, Rotten Debile.
Hello.
I love that everyone tries to do it.
Tries being the operative word. I can't pull it off.
You can't pull off a Crypt Keeper. You could do other voices, you know?
Yeah, I could. I'll think about that for next year.
Oh yeah, there we go. Anyway, yeah, so here we are for the final installment of Geeky Gentleman Horror Month 2018. We are talking, we're doing our special discussion topics. So the way Horror Month typically works, since I've gained quite a few subscribers over this year, is we just do horror movie reviews all the way through and do a special topic discussion on Halloween. And so here we are, a special topic discussion. Mm-hmm. So Ruben, what are we discussing today?
What is the best medium for horror?
Yeah, and like I was thinking about this all day, and I'm like, oh shit, what if we can't get an hour out of this? Because I have a very strongly held opinion and a very good reason for that opinion, and I'm really not sure if I'm going to be swayed on that or how much I can buy any arguments on it. So why don't we start with your opinion, if you even have one?
Okay. Well, I'm gonna say movies in general, but I'm not hard on that stance. I think there could be exceptions. I don't really read or watch a lot of horror anyway, but like I've read novels. Like Stephen King is known as being a horror novelist, but like I've read It, which I think would classify as a horror novel, but I don't really think much of it is. I wasn't really scared reading it. There were times where I was enthralled. I was just like, I cannot put this down, and I would read 30 or 40 pages in one sitting, but I was never at any point like scared while reading it, if that makes sense. And there's scenes from that, and I haven't seen the most recent It movie, but there are scenes in that book that were not in the 1990 miniseries. If you put them in a movie, I would be terrified. But just in the book, I was like, this is good writing when I read it when I was like 16. But, like this is good writing, but I wouldn't say I'm scared while reading it. So I think there's, you can have good writing that in another medium would be horror, but it's, for me, I guess I'm having trouble like pinning down what I would classify as horror, because like for me, I just classify it as if it scares me, then it's horror. And so books don't really do it for me. And like movies, I've talked about it a lot this month. They use a lot of cheap tricks like, jump scares and musical cues and stuff to try and get you to, be scared a little bit. And you don't have those tools in your belt whenever you're writing a book or something like that. So
you think that movies are the best medium for horror then, because they can like legitimately shock you?
Yes, but I think there are other media, but I think movies would probably be the best one that I've seen used.
Okay. And see, I think that's interesting, and I definitely will concede that film has a gigantic advantage because it can work with so many different things. Mm-hmm. Sound and imagery and just, editing techniques. There's so much in the wheelhouse for a horror movie to do that can really fuck with your head. In particular, I think of I always bring this up from The Shining, but it's just such a good example of really disturbing filmmaking, because you watch that film and the whole film just feels weird and off and strange. And part of the reason for that is the Overlook Hotel has impossible architecture. In that, like, you'll see walls that are maybe a foot thick, but then you'll keep going down the hallway for that wall, and there's like multiple room hotel rooms, and that's just not possible. You can't have a wall that's only a foot thick and then have a room that's 3 to 4 layers deep, right?
Right.
And like, the camera, it's not an accident. The camera's intentionally showing this stuff off because it wants to fuck with you. It's just it irks your head and ruins part of what you're watching, and just bothers you on a fundamental level.
Yeah.
So I definitely will concede that film has an advantage, but I think that the written word, that prose, is definitively, inarguably, the best medium for horror. And of course, that doesn't mean that there are not horror movies that are scarier than, like, there's horror movies that are really good and scary book and horror books that are really bad, but that doesn't mean that, just because there are better horror movies that all and bad fiction, that fiction's inferior, or vice versa. Just because there are a lot of bad horror movies isn't what makes books better. For me, I think the reason that horror works better in prose than anywhere else is the relationship between audience and medium. So when you're watching a movie and there's scary stuff happening on film, there's stuff that bothers you on film, you can hide from it. It's kind of the cliche image of someone like pulling a blanket up over their head or covering their eyes or something, not watching, not having to be there for it. You can't do that and still experience a book.
Right.
Like, when there's something that happens in a book that's bothering you, you can stop reading it, but the second you stop reading it, the book stops. There's no getting through it. There's no, like, covering your eyes, plugging your ears, and waiting it out. If you stop reading it because it's bothered you enough, then you don't get to continue. You don't get to get there unless you cheat and, like, read the last page. And then you certainly did not experience the book. And that is incredibly profound, but what makes that really, really interesting to me is you can't stop it and truly experience the piece, but also you're doing it to yourself, and that makes it freaky. Like, when you're... Is there a thing, like a phobia you have on, like, something on film that, like, you just can't watch that shit?
I don't know how often I see it, but, like, if I see someone, like, starting to poke someone's eyeball, like, if you have a knife and someone starts to carve out an eyeball, I wouldn't watch that.
Yeah, that really freaks you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. For me, it's like surgery. Like, I really get fucked with surgery and surgical stuff. I hate hanging out with my mom and her friends because all old people do is talk about their surgeries. So just even hearing people talk about it sometimes fucks with me. I remember reading a book. It wasn't even a horror book, but it definitely was playing on some horror elements here and there. I remember reading a book in which, like, it's probably only a 3 or 4 paragraph section, but this person, this author vividly describes someone going into anaphylactic shock and the process of trying to save that person's life, of like cutting open their throat and putting the pipe down so that they could breathe through that, all that shit. And I remember reading that and literally sweating and feeling queasy because I was doing it to myself. And it is such a vividly profound experience and works on the nature of you are putting yourself through this. Like, yeah, the author wrote down the words, but no one's making you read them. And yet, in order to finish the piece, you have to do it. And so for me, that is why I think prose is the best medium for horror, because it's all on you. And anyone can do it. Like, you could, it would take more work, but you can write prose in Braille. If you have the ability to understand language, you have the ability to consume prose. And so it's all on you. And I find that really fascinating.
See, it's funny you say that, because while I was hearing you describe that, I was thinking that almost sounds like a weakness of prose, because if it's scaring me, then I have the power to just put it down. And so it loses some of that impact for me. But if it's a movie, sure, I could pause the movie, but like how many people are going to do that? Like, you know, like, unless I just have the remote in hand ready to hit the pause button whenever it gets too intense. Like, most people will at least sit through a movie even if it's scary. But like with a book, if it starts to get too intense, I can just put it down. And so it loses some of what the effect would be if it was a movie for me.
Maybe. But like, I guess it just depends on how committed you feel to finishing a book that you start, you know? And like, I think there's a difference between a book losing your interest and never finishing it, and a book scaring you away from it. And like, if a book scares you away from it because of its descriptions of things, is that not just evidence that it's doing such a good job of scaring you? That like it is perfecting horror to that level that you can't even fuck with it anymore. You have to walk away from it.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's the thing, is like, yes, you can walk away from it, you can stop reading it, but then that's just, maybe I'm cheating, but that's a testament then to how well it's doing at presenting horror.
Yeah. And like I said, like, I also just haven't read enough to really have an informed opinion on horror in prose. Like, when I read it, like, there were scenes where I was thinking, if this was in a movie or a TV, you know, if I was seeing it happen instead of reading about it, I'd be scared out of my mind. But just reading about it, I felt somewhat disconnected from it. And I don't know if that's just me or if that's a lot of people. But and
I don't know. It's an interesting question.
I don't know. Like, what are some prose stories you've read where you were just like enthralled by it and you were like, this is incredible horror prose?
American Psycho.
Okay.
That book is utterly disgusting, and I can never eat spray cheese again because of it. Not that I was like all about spray cheese beforehand that I read American Psycho, but like every time I look at spray cheese after reading American Psycho, I just can't do it. The interesting thing about that book is about the first third of it is just him describing his like morning moisturizing routine and what he does at work, and just really intense detail of the absolutely mundane of like his lifestyle and his beauty regimen and his exercise routine. And then the murders start to happen, and he starts to and he describes them all in the same way, just ad nauseum. It's absolutely ridiculously detailed. To just there's no reason for it. It's that detailed. And so just to read that book, it takes a lot of willpower to just push through and make yourself read it, because at least for me, I don't know if you have this experience, but when I read prose, I am imagining everything that's being put on the page in my head. And so to push through the kinds of intensely graphic descriptions in the book does take a lot of work. And then to realize just the level of personhood, because the whole argument for American Psycho is, oh, well, maybe none of it actually happened. Maybe it's all just in his head, in which case, is it really that bad? And the answer is no, it's worse. If he's not actually doing all of it and he's just thinking about it constantly, that's even worse. But then you get to some of the meta commentary in there, in which Patrick Bateman's Wall Street friends are in fact worse people than him. I think it's the character McDermott. At one point they leave a bar and McDermott like sees a homeless person and kicks the shit out of them, then takes $100 bill, lights it on fire, and drops it in front of their face before they all get into a cab and leave and go to another bar. And it's just disgusting kind of behavior that just like literally is hard to comprehend people doing this kind of stuff. So yeah, American Psycho, I think, does an excellent job of displaying, at least to my taste, horror that I have a legitimately hard time pushing through. And it's not to say that there isn't horror that's like unnerving, but not necessarily giving me pause while I read it. But then there's other stuff. I'm trying to remember what King book it was. I want to say it was like a collection of 4 novellas, and it's the same one that has Shawshank Redemption in it. But there's like I'm trying to remember the name of the story. An Apt Pupil.
Okay.
I think it's called, where a kid realizes that his neighbor was a Nazi.
Yeah.
Nazi death camp captain or some shit like that. And so he just gets fascinated by him and starts to like emulate him, and like goes over to his house and starts like burning animals alive and in the dude's oven and just all this other crazy shit. And I think at one point they like kidnap someone. That one's just, it's legitimately disturbing and unnerving to read, because it's just such a tortured psychology to imagine someone like, and it's terrible because you know it's real. You know conceptually there are people who idolize Nazism and like look up to the things that they did and go, oh wow, that's so cool. And then to just put yourself there reading that character, living their experience, it fucks with you. It's just hard to get through, in my opinion. Which is what makes it so good, because kind of the thing I hate about horror on film is the cult fun we're all in on it status that a lot of horror, iconic horror, tends to get. That the fact that a lot of horror on film tends to turn to camp very quickly bothers me, and people kind of like sit on the sidelines and cheer it on and get all excited about like the stuff that goes on film. So like you'll look through the fan base of a horror thing, and there's like the kill count, and people do like the top 10 Jason kills or the top 10 Predator kills or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I get it on some level. I certainly went through that, but I kind of hate that because that's just proof that it's not horrifying you. It's entertaining a sick part of your head. Maybe on some level that's scary, but it's not legitimately horrifying at that point. You're not feeling the fear.
Yeah, possibly, yeah. So let me ask you this. This is kind of taking us in a new direction, unless you wanted to talk more about like pros. Because I had another thought about another media that I think maybe could work, and I've never really. Have you ever like listened to any like horror podcasts?
Not a ton. I've heard a few here and there. The one that jumps to mind, it's more of like a dark comedy, but it's got horror elements into it. Is Welcome to Night Vale.
See, I've heard of that, and that's what I was thinking of, and I really didn't know anything about it. But I was wondering how, because that's another one that I think could potentially be really, and maybe it's not horrifying, maybe it's just creepy, but like being able to just be right there next to you. And I don't know how people enjoy podcasts, if they, put it on their iPhone and they go for a run, or if they just, clean the house while listening to it. I don't know how other people do it, but that's something where I think that could potentially be very scary, listening to something like that while you're doing whatever you do, depending on a podcast.
No, you're definitely right. I feel like some of the advantages that exist outside of film, because film can have like really scary monster designs, but then they can only do so much with it. Mm-hmm. Like I tend to think of what's a good example of this? Is it fair to say that, yeah, let's go with the Xenomorph. Like the Xenomorph in Alien, the original Alien. It was just a black guy with a couple of costume pieces on for most of the shots you see of it in the film. They had to do the whole Jaws thing where they couldn't show the monster too much because the budget didn't allow for it. Mm-hmm. So, like, but that doesn't mean that the Xenomorph isn't a fantastic creature design, right?
Right.
So they've designed a fantastically horrifying creature, but their ability to display it on film is limited. And then even as you go forward, once the Alien films start getting a budget, they have a harder and harder time moving them and stuff. Like the whole Alien 3 has a really bad shot of a Xenomorph running down a hallway. Alien 4 Resurrection is just garbage CGI in a lot of it. They just have a hard time visualizing it, and then it gets to a certain point where it's on screen too much, Mm-hmm. Or it can, at least. I'm not going to call out any specific thing, but it can get to a certain point where it's on screen too much. And so then you're kind of losing part of it because you're just getting too good of a look at it.
And that could be for anything. Like, when Superman the movie came out, they advertised that movie as, look, the special effects are amazing. You'll believe that a man can fly. By the time you get to the fourth one, I've never seen it, but like I imagine the effects for Superman flying were just fine. But I think by that point, people were kind of just, it's another Superman movie. And, that could be with anything, like not just horror.
No, definitely. So, like the ability to visualize in motion, monsters and scary things, like the spectacle side of horror, can kind of drop off after a while, whereas other things can capture the visual side of horror quite well, or just circumvent it. So, comics, I think, are a good example, because you can read some horror comics and you can look at some stuff and just be like, oh, fuck, that's bothersome. I just picked up this book a couple weeks ago called It Came Out on a Wednesday. And it's a short horror anthology comic. And there's just an image of this kid who's like, just a bunch of rats are wearing his skin like a suit.
Ooh.
And so, like, you just got, like, rat mouths and stuff peeping out from the different holes, and it's a freaky fucking image.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of sticks in your head as soon as you see it. And, yeah, you couldn't necessarily pull that off on screen, but you can draw it 7 or 8 times a page and have it look just as freaky and just as disturbing every time you see it. So, like, you can maintain that. Similar to what you're saying with audio, if you don't have to show it, you can create any kind of creepy ass shit that you want to in a story.
Yeah. That reminds me of, I don't think you've read it, like the Alan Moore Swamp Thing comics. I was reading some of those recently, and those were really created to be horror comics. They're a little bit of fantasy element there and supernatural, but it was mostly trying to be horror. And for me, it never really came across as horror. It came across as just really, really creepy. Like, there's a lot of stuff where it's like, that's really gross and really disgusting, but I don't know if it ever scared me.
Okay, well, like, go ahead and finish your point, but I got a question.
Oh,
after.
just like, I don't know, like, and maybe it's just that I'm very picky when it comes to, like, horror in general. Because, like, you've got some stuff where it's just like a serial killer. Like, serial killers exist in real life, and I'm sure, like, police officers who investigated, like, John Wayne Gacy, they probably are, really put off by any movie that glorifies serial killers, like you were talking about, like Freddy or Jason. They, someone who, like, investigated a real life serial killer probably would be kind of scared of something like that. But, like, someone like, that's not something I've ever really looked into in real life. So those don't really do anything for me. But then there are things that I am scared of. And if they made a movie of it, really picked up on what it is that's scary about it, it could be terrifying, and I would never watch the first 5 minutes of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question I have for you, because I feel like we've been dancing around it, what do you define horror as?
For me, it's just really broad. I think if it's scary, I would kind of call it that. Like, for horror movies, I generally kind of have probably a pretty narrow definition of it. I don't watch a lot of it, but like I mentioned a couple weeks ago, like any of those slasher movies, like Freddy, Jason, Michael, Chucky, I would call all of that's a huge chunk of the horror pie, if you will. But then, like, there's like these monster type movies. Here in the last, like, 15 years, we've gotten more of, like, a psychological horror. Like, I don't know how good they are, but, like, the Saw movies or the Purge movies, those kind of hit, like, the Purge. I've never seen any of the movies, but they hit on this scary idea of what if society all just, was held together by everyone wants to kill each other. And, like, that could be really scary. Like, your next door neighbor.
It's like someone read, like, the first sentence of Hume and then stopped.
Yeah. So, like, there's a wide variety of horror, and when we get right down to it, and I start to think about, well, that thing really counts as.
Oh, no, wait, Hobbes. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I'm naming philosophers wrong. They start with an H. Anyway.
Oh, I was for a minute. I knew you were talking about the philosopher, but my mind went to Calvin and Hobbes, and I knew that wasn't what you were talking about. But I laughed anyway. But yeah, like you start to think about like, oh well, that also counts as horror, and then I realized there's a lot more that classifies as horror than what I'm initially giving credit for when I first think of it.
Yeah, I don't know, like, for me, when I think of horror, I do kind of have more of a floating definition, so I think it'd just be useful here. I pulled up the Wikipedia article for horror fiction. Horror is a genre of speculative fiction which is intended to, or has the capacity to, frighten, scare, disgust, or startle its readers or viewers by inducing feelings of horror and terror. Literary historian J.A. Cudden has defined the horror story as a piece of fiction in prose of variable length which shocks or even frightens the reader or perhaps induces a feeling of repulsion or loathing. It creates an eerie and frightening atmosphere. Horror is frequently supernatural, though it can be non-supernatural. Often the central menace of a work of horror fiction can be interpreted as a metaphor for the larger fears of a society. So that's something I think is just useful to have, like a working definition, because I definitely get that from everything horror. Like, just because I'm of the opinion that prose is the best medium for horror, it's not because I don't think that film or comics or audio, as you put it, cannot work. I think all of those things can work to great degrees and some superior to others, depending on the piece. For me, the reason that I think prose works so well is just that it's you doing it to yourself. Did you read Morrison's Multiversity at all?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a really interesting metafiction, and it's all about the idea of a universe which you are creating, destroying, and affecting, because you're reading it. We don't look at our responsibility to a piece enough. When you engage with a piece of art, you are bringing that into existence all over again, but more importantly, you're bringing yourself to it. Because I think everyone's had the experience of listening to a song that you've heard 100 times before, but you just happen to be going through something in your life, and suddenly the lyrics of that song suddenly have a more personal connection to you again, right? Like suddenly it feels like the song's made for you. And I feel like we don't focus on the fact that we bring ourselves to a piece, and so not only are we bringing it to life, but we are adding ourselves into it. We are adding our own emotions into it and taking stuff from it there. And so that's why I feel that horror works so well in prose, particularly with that definition of it can often be a metaphor for a larger fear in society, because you have your own fears that you bring to a work. And so you can read some horror and not even realize that you were afraid of a particular thing that the work is exploring.
And you know, that whole idea of like the audience is a active participant in fiction, that's part of Morrison's manifesto going all the way back to Animal Man. But also like Scott McCloud, he wrote a book, Understanding Comics, and he talked about a little bit the idea of closure in comics, where like you have two panels, and the first panel is like a crazy killer with an axe above their head and somebody on the ground screaming, and then the second panel is just silence, no more screaming, but it's like it's panned out, and now you just see the city, and then you just, like, the sound effect is just thud or something, like the axe hitting the person. And he said, like, that's not actually, you're not actually seeing the death, but your mind is filling in the gaps and it's creating closure there. And that idea is all over fiction, and especially horror fiction. I took a class in college where a guy said, I don't remember, he accredited this quote to somebody, but he was saying that, like, as soon as you see a monster in a movie, if it's a 30-foot monster, you're going to say, well, thank goodness it's not a 50-foot monster. And so that's what you were talking about, like with Jaws and Alien. You know, once you see it, then it's scary, but it's not as scary as it was in your mind. And that is very much a part of, like, any horror. Like, I would say just about, like, especially in these franchise horror pieces, like the first Jason movie is probably much scarier than the 8th Jason movie, or, you know, when each sequel, the monster or the creature or whatever it is, the antagonistic force is going to lose some of that power because you keep seeing more of it, and your mind is no longer doing as much of the work in creating that horror for the writer.
Exactly, and so that's why I think that horror works so well on the page, because it's almost all you. And, like, the only time it doesn't work better on the page is, or let me rephrase that. The only time that it works better is when you're too young for the page. When I have sparse memories of my early childhood, but I remember being afraid of things, and I remember the feeling of utter powerlessness, just like that there's nothing you can do, because there is nothing you can do, right? That you feel as a kid when someone tells you something that scares you. And it can often be so simple and so stupid and so nothing. But just, it's so freaky, and your imagination's completely unchecked at that age because you don't know what's actually possible in the world and what isn't. So it's filling in everything for you. And so in my mind, at least, prose-based horror is the closest thing that can get you back to that, because it deals with like putting the onus on you to fill in most of the detail work. And that's why I think, like, Lovecraft is so damn good. It's just fucking freaky, and he uses lack of detail, lack of express detail to make it worse. So it's not, this monster was so terrifying, let me describe it to you, it was 80 foot tall and had tentacles. No, it's this monster was so terrifying, the words to describe it do not exist. And if I tried, and the memory of thinking on it would drive me to madness. And so then, like, you say something like that, and it's immediately like, don't think of pink elephants. Your mind goes straight to pink fucking elephants. Like, you say, there's no words to describe the horrificness of this monster. Well, what was it? What did it look like? What's the most horrifying monster I can imagine? It's worse than that? Shit!
And we talked a little bit about that when we talked about, was it At the Mountains of Madness a few months ago? And, that's something that, like, I think Lovecraft kind of had a reputation for doing this, where it's like, he would just say it's an indescribable city, or the monster was indescribable, and then leave it at that. And that is something, you're right, prose can do that. A movie cannot. I would feel so cheated if they made a movie of At the Mountains of Madness, and then you're just seeing like the characters on the plane flying away from the continent, and then they're all saying like, man, that's crazy, will you look at that? And then we don't get to see it. Like that would be extremely narratively unsatisfying. And a book can do that. A book can say, like, to this day, I will never sleep a sound night again because I will always think of what I saw, and then just, vaguely dance around it. And then your mind, the reader's mind, does all the work. And that's something also, taking it back to Morrison, he does that a lot too. Like he'll have just things that your mind cannot quite grasp, like, I can smell color or something like that. Like, the Superman of the 853rd dimension or whatever, like, weird stuff like that. He'll just create these impossible descriptions.
Lifting a book with infinite pages.
Right. Stuff like that, yeah. And not even necessarily horror stuff, but just stuff that makes you sit back and say, hey, wait a second, what? And it's like, it just very weird creative stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's the thing about it that works so well. So let me ask you this, since you said you didn't have necessarily a very strong opinion, do you think that I'm right?
I think there's aspects of prose that can work really well that cannot be done in any other media, and I would say that's true for every piece of media. Like there's aspects of if you were to do a audio play or a podcast or whatever, there's things about that would work that you cannot do in a TV show. But I still am gonna say, like, for me, it's very hard for a book to scare me because if it gets a little bit intense, I can just put it down and go take a 3-minute walk and then come back, and I lose some of that fear that I wouldn't be able to lose that as much with a TV or a movie thing. And so for me, it's hard for me to say that a book is going to be really scary. And also, I just don't do that much reading also, so that's just on me.
Okay. I mean, fair enough. It's just, it's interesting then that you think film so for you, the reason film kind of works is you feel kind of trapped there because you're not really, like, the social contract of not turning off a movie, not walking away from a movie kind of thing kind of keeps you in your seat.
Yeah. And like, yeah, and I'm weird. If I'm in the living room watching on the actual television, I'm more apt to finish through something or just not pause it. If I'm watching on my computer monitor, if it's really scary or if it's just something I'm not interested in, I can just stop. Like I'm just literally an arm's length from my mouse and I can just turn it off. Like, so if it's like, wow, this really sucks, I don't want to spend an hour watching this, then I'll stop doing it. But if I'm in my living room, I'm less likely to do that. But yeah, there is that kind of unspoken obligation that I feel to, like, go ahead and finish, or at least not pause it, and just go, like, I want to get it done. I don't want to be here for 5 hours watching this hour-long whatever.
Okay. So what is something on film then that has legitimately horrified you?
Well, when I was a kid, I was in elementary school, and I remember begging and pleading my parents to watch It. This was the miniseries, and as an adult, it doesn't really scare me that much, but as a kid, I remember having nightmares for a week after watching that. And it was just little bits and pieces of it. Like, there were some parts that weren't scary, but, like, I remember like the scene where they had the photo album and, like, his hand reaches out towards them like that. I don't remember everything else. Like the part where the kid is in the shower and he comes out of the shower stall, and, like, it's not even stuff like when he comes out of the shower stall, he doesn't try and kill the kid, which would be scary. He just sits there and stares at the kid, which as an adult is really creepy. But, like, that, I remember really it giving me nightmares when I was a kid. And, like, I don't think of anything has given me nightmares as an adult in any movie or anything like that. But that one was a big one.
Okay. So when you were a kid, but like you feel like you've kind of gotten over it as an adult. But I know you're not the biggest horror fan.
Mm-hmm.
So like, you said that like the idea of someone fucking with like ripping out an eyeball, if that was shown intensely on film, that would bother you.
Yeah.
Have you watched Hostel?
No, I remember. I remember when it came out. When I was. Is that the one where it's like? See, I'm getting Hostel confused with Saw, and I haven't seen any of the Saw movies either. But I remember Hostel coming out when I was in high school because I remember people saying they wanted to see it, but I haven't seen it. No.
Yeah, I think you should kind of make yourself. Because I feel like it's weird because I don't particularly care for Hostel or the Saw movies or anything like that. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen Hostel, I'll admit, just because I don't really care for the whole torture porn side of horror. And I think in retrospect, it like a lot of people that are really into those franchises do just kind of have some fucked up stuff that they need to deal with. But at the same time, I'm not going to deny, yeah, that shit's kind of freaky. To see a body torn up like that could really bother someone. And so if something like really gory were to actually is something that's actually going to get to you, yeah, I'd say watch it. And that's the weird part is like, I know it's going to bother me, so I'm going to make myself do it. And I don't know, maybe this is a completely separate discussion, but maybe this is a good time to branch out and talk about it and talk about in connection to our two chosen mediums, why we feel that horror is a good thing to experience and why we think that you should experience them in this way.
Okay.
So, what in your opinion makes horror worthwhile? When we are defined it as this thing that's meant to, freak you, meant to bother you. Why should you put yourself through something like that?
Okay, well, and I'll go ahead and say, like, I'm probably going to sound like a hypocrite saying this because I don't put myself through it very often. I generally, when I watch or read something, I want to enjoy it and I want to have fun and usually escape from the terrible world we live in. But I think, like, if we look at, like, The Babadook, that was a movie about, like, you were and I were kind of thinking, like, postpartum depression and possibly, like, dealing with a non-neurotypical child, possibly. And so, like, that movie kind of gives you an, not really an escape, but kind of offers a solution, maybe. And so, like, if you find yourself struggling with those things, then maybe The Babadook is a nice cathartic way of dealing with it, or at least showing that, hey, you're not the only one. And so it's kind of escapist, I guess, like how, growing up, I read a lot of X-Men comics, and I would see a lot of people say, like, hey, the X-Men is great. If you feel like you are a minority, then you can see that the X-Men or even Spider-Man, that they also feel like they don't fit in. And so, like, in the same way, I think that horror can do that. Like, The Babadook is just an example off the top of my head. But then, like, these serial killers like Jason or Michael, like, serial killers are a real thing. And so, like, that taps into a horror that people have in real life. I don't necessarily think that those movies are as edifying as something like The Babadook, but I'm trying to think of another good example of something where it can be beneficial to you. But I would say, like, maybe that's why, because it can help you, like, on a not a spiritual level, but, like, help you cope with something.
Yeah, that's an interpretation of horror that I hear quite a bit. That, like, it makes it safer. Mm-hmm. It takes the thing that bothers you. It takes these natural things that bother people, and explores them, forces you to spend time with them, and creates a catharsis because it forces you to go through it, so it forces you to live your worst nightmare and be better for it, is kind of the idea that I hear thrown around a lot. And I can definitely see that. I can definitely see that interpretation. I can definitely see that viewpoint. I don't necessarily think that's the only role horror fills. I think that's certainly a role. I don't know. It's hard to talk about because I'm tempted to call horror somewhat new. Not like significantly, not last 20, 30 years, more last like 2-3 centuries, but still. Because stories just used to have an element of horror in them. You know? Arachne got turned into a fucking spider because Athena was pissed. Cinderella's stepsisters cut off body parts. Hansel and Gretel were eaten alive by a witch. Like, all of these iconic, like, classic stories, a lot of them have what we would just, like, if you were to put that shit on film now, that'd be a fucking horror movie. If you were to literally adapt Cinderella from, like, the Russian version of Cinderella or some shit, it'd be a fucking horror movie through and through. There's no denying it.
Yeah.
But, like, we've kind of sectioned horror off and refined it and let it grow on its own. And that makes it really interesting to me. Because, like, you know, there used to be an element of horror in a lot of stories, and of course there still is, but it's definitely not as prevalent and as graphic as it used to be. But there used to be an element of horror in all stories, and now we've just kind of sectioned it off and let it fester and seethe and grow into its own thing almost entirely. And that's weird. And I don't know, I think you should put yourself through it, not because in spite of the fact that it makes you uncomfortable, but because it makes you uncomfortable. I think it's like, I cannot stand my mother. She refuses to watch any horror movie ever. She hates horror movies. It doesn't matter even what it's about. Just if it's a horror movie, like, I'll start to play something, she goes, "No, I hate that shit. Just won't watch it. Anything with violence, anything like that." And I'm like, no, this is good for you on some level. You should do this because it's hard. I don't know. I think that the cathartic side of things is definitely there, and there's definitely probably some personal growth to be gained from horror, but I don't know, like, so much of art is meant to be accessible and meant to impact you in a positive way. I think there's something fascinating and scary and interesting about a piece of art that is meant to have a negative effect on you to a certain degree, or that is meant to harm in some ways. I think there's something worthwhile about that because it then reminds you of the power of art. Like, you don't realize how like, I feel there's a temptation to look at artistic expression and not put the level of importance that it deserves on it until you have something that really profoundly affects you. And I think that horror can do a good job of reminding you how profoundly it can affect you, but do it in a bad way. And so that maybe it'll make the happy endings just a little bit happier. It'll make you stop taking advantage of those other things.
Yeah. I still don't know if I subscribe to that idea. Like I said earlier, my entertainment is escapist entertainment. If life is crappy, I don't want to watch something that's going to make me feel terrified or, make me feel worse in some level. I would rather just watch something happy or, not watch something at all. But I can, if other people, if that works for them, then I'm going to say I'm very happy that it works for you. But for me, like, if I have a terrible day at work, I don't want to go home and then watch something scary that's not going to make me feel better.
Mm-hmm.
But
and I definitely have that too. Like, I've had days where I just wanted something simple and fun and purely for self-enjoyment, not to challenge me.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I think there's something important in being challenged by a piece, I feel like there's points at which it's good for you to be challenged by a piece. And, Ruben, you always say, oh, I just like to read things for entertainment and escapism. But, like, I've seen some of the stuff you read, and it's not exactly just there for entertainment and escapism. Like, a lot of what's going on in it is deeper than that. And so I think you're just entertained and escape into fairly deep things without necessarily realizing it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. And I'm not saying I'm completely 100% against, like, an entire genre or something, but I'd say I wouldn't do it often.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But yeah, that do you I don't know if I'm trying to think of, I feel like there was something else about the horror genre that I was going to want to say, and I don't remember what it was. It probably wasn't.
Yeah, I've been talking like a lot this episode because it's a really complicated ass idea, and I'm trying my best to explain it without getting into all my philosophy words.
Mm-hmm.
I really like my philosophy words, but I always try my best to express the ideas in a manner that doesn't have to fuck with those, because I just find them alienating half the time. They're really good at expressing singular, specific ideas and intents, but that's kind of useless if people don't even know what the word means. So yeah, I've been talking my fucking ass off this episode. I apologize.
Hey, we were able to make it through. You were afraid we weren't going to be able to make it through an hour, so it worked.
Mm-hmm. There we go. Success. All right. Well, we do need to fill just a couple more minutes at the very least. So we've talked about the different mediums. Is there a medium that you think is just, it doesn't work? Like, you cannot produce anything quote unquote horrifying in this medium?
I don't know if I would say it doesn't work, but television, I don't know if, and maybe it's just because there hasn't been as much of it. You were saying that horror is a relatively recent genre, and like I would say it started in like novels, and then it made its way into film, but we still haven't really seen it a whole lot in TV. You had like the Scream TV show or the American Horror Story TV show, and like there's more that I'm not being able to think of, like The Strain or something like that, but most of the time, it seems like horror just stays in movies. And you would think, and I don't know if it's because, like, if you're watching something that's going to have a high body count in a TV show, it's going to be difficult to maintain the suspense. Like 5 years later, like, you're either going to kill off all the characters that people fell in love with, or you're not going to kill anyone off, and then you lose that suspension, like The Walking Dead. It's not a show that I watch, but like people are upset that they kill off characters that they love, but then if they don't kill off these characters that they love, then you're going to have a show where there's no stakes and there's no danger because all these characters are surviving all these high stakes. So like, I don't know if TV is the best place for horror, but I'm not going to say that it's a place where it won't work.
I mean, I kind of, as soon as you said that, I wanted to say, what about Tales from the Crypt? Which is one of my favorite things ever. And I think the thing that Tales from the Crypt does, of course, is it's an anthology series, so it doesn't have to worry about that. Same with American Horror Story. It's an anthology series. It doesn't have to worry about long-term stakes becoming a problem. They can kill off all the characters and tell the story and continue on to another season without a problem.
And like,
so no, I wouldn't.
What's that show on Netflix? Black Mirror.
Yeah.
And like Tales from the Crypt, I don't know a lot about it, but I also thought it was kind of a comedy horror, like that it.
It's very schlocky.
Okay.
It is very schlocky type of horror, but there are some episodes that fucking bug, man. There's an episode in, I want to say it's season 1 or 2, where this guy and his wife are on their anniversary vacation, and the guy's friend is like paying for everything. He's lent them their cabin in this remote area. It's beautiful. It's on a lake. All this shit. He's just doing so much for their marriage to try to help them out, and the guy's like been laid off of his job, and he's just feeling all bitter and shitty, and like his wife's just trying to have a good time, and so like, you know, her and the friend keep going out on the lake and all this stuff, and the guy's just sitting there getting more and more bitter and angry, and he's like, oh, she's cheating on me with him, and they think I'm an idiot for not even realizing it's happening underneath my nose. And then he ends up like killing his wife, and he's dragging the body across the dock of the lake and into a little like fishing house or some shit, and he opens the door like with the dead body in his hand, and there's like his entire family that had come up for a surprise party.
Oh.
And they're just sitting there looking at him with his dead wife in his arms.
Oh no.
And it's like, yeah, it's like, there's like schlocky, stupid episodes of Tales from the Crypt, no denying it. But then there's shit like that. It's just like, fuck. Because I don't know, I feel like everyone that's been in a long-term relationship has had feelings of annoyance is too small and petty. Has had feelings of bitterness towards their significant other, and it's just part of living with someone. Is no one's perfect all the time. People are people, and you just have to learn to deal with them. So to take something like that and just emphasize it gets at you. But no, I think Tales from the Crypt does horror really, really well on television. And even then, I'd still loop it in with film as a whole, as opposed to just movies. For me, I have a really hard time getting horror in music. I don't know how you do that.
Yeah.
Like, you can shock with music. You can play like a little light, lovely melody and all of a sudden turn it into screamo metal or some shit. But I don't know how you horrify with music. I don't know how you, like, disturb someone with music. And I'll let you do lyrics, and, like, you could tell a scary story lyrically in a song, I imagine, but I don't know, usually it takes me so long to figure out what's going on in a song lyrically that I'd have a hard time being surprised by the horror of it, you know?
I'm the same way. It takes me many listens to a song before I can figure out what's being said.
Yeah, so I don't know if you could, like, I'm sure someone's done it. I know Steve and Deadpoolzilla were telling me about this this band that did a whole album. I think they called it the Silver Scream, and it's all about like horror movie monsters and stuff. But I don't know how you do horror in music, and have it really work. I think it is the least suited. I'll say that much.
I agree. I didn't even think of it because it's not something that I would think of. Like, when I listen to music, I cannot think of a single, even something like Rob Zombie, where it's like, it's weird and it's creepy, but it's not scary. And there's
like I could never imagine myself having to stop a song because it's bothering me on that level. I just, maybe I'm wrong. If someone's got something, leave it in the comments. Let me know. But I just can't see it.
Yeah, I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, this is a good discussion. Everyone, I hope you have a very happy Halloween. Please join us next month for Geeky Gentleman History Month.
Oh.
Yay! My favorite month of the year.
All right.
Alrighty. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
And I'm the Comics Kid 2099.
And we are your ghouly gentlemen. And we will be discussing things from beyond the